My mother-in-law, that is the mother of my husband, Mike, my mother-in-law died last month in February. We got to be with her the day that she died, and I thought I would share with you some of our experiences and talk about how American culture handles death. I know that different countries, different cultures have different customs for the death of a loved one. But one thing is certain, even though there are differences between our cultures, we all are going to experience either our own death or the death of a loved one sometime in our life, unless Jesus comes back first.
English Without Fear, where you can learn to speak English naturally through listening to stories.
So let me tell you a little bit about Mike's mom, my mother-in-law. For years, she lived in a retirement home, a residence in Seattle, which is a big city in the state of Washington. Americans more and more don't have their elderly old parents live with them. The parents like to be independent. My father moved into a retirement facility, a retirement place, and had his own two-bedroom apartment. And that is what my in-laws, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law, did in Seattle. 1 year after they moved in to this lovely two-bedroom apartment, my father-in-law died. So my mother-in-law, Terry, was a widow. Seattle is a long way from us here in Alabama and Mike's brother Steve, who lives in North Carolina. My mother-in-law started to decline in health. And it was really difficult to always be going out to Seattle. And a year and a half ago, she got really, really sick and almost died. I have to tell you, when my mother-in-law died last month, she was 95. That's really old. So after that near-death illness, Steve, my brother-in-law, convinced her to move across the country to a retirement complex, a retirement building near him and his wife. And she did. But over time, she kept on declining. Her body was wearing out. So what led up to her death? She couldn't swallow food or liquid like water anymore. And she lost a lot of weight. She got down to 36 kilos, which is about 79 pounds in America. Steve had to put her in the hospital on a Monday. This is last month. And it became clear she was dying. And so what happens here is that a person either goes home to die or they go to a place called hospice. And that's a place to take care of people as they die. Steve, my brother-in-law, and his wife did not have the capacity, the ability to take care of her at their house. So she went to this hospice place. It was small. We got up there, so all this happened really quickly. Mike and I drove 6.5 hours to North Carolina, and we arrived at the hospice. It's kind of like a small hospital. She was in her own room, and there were two nurses that came in every hour and checked on her. She was very much aware that this was it, that she was dying. And she was mentally okay, but she was afraid, I think, of dying alone. She had lost all her abilities, couldn't eat, couldn't drink, couldn't walk, couldn't get herself out of bed, could hardly talk. That's hard. That's very hard. Now, I said she was in a hospice facility, a hospice center, or a hospice hospital. You can be at home and dying, and hospice nurses will come to your house and check on you every day. That's the other delivery service, the other way hospice takes care of dying people. And they help the families too, because this is hard on families. There's grief, and there are so many unknowns. What do we do? How is the dying process going to be handled? So we saw her on a Thursday afternoon. We came back the next morning, and she had been given an injection of a little bit of morphine, which was able to take away the discomfort, the suffering from not drinking and not eating. So she was asleep when we got there, and she looked dead. It was a shock. But she woke up, and we had the morning with her, and she got to speak on FaceTime with her beloved, her niece, also named Terry, whom she loved. She got to see her face. She got to hear her niece tell her over and over the good news of Jesus, and just to relax and just to fall into Jesus's arms, and how much her niece loved her. That was wonderful. And we brought our lunch into her room, and we were eating our lunch and talking with her. We were reading her from the Bible. My husband sang a hymn to her. And then I'd say after we ate lunch, she fell asleep. The nurses came in and gave her a little bit more of morphine. But then something really wonderful happened. There's a pastor that knows her because she would go over to the retirement place and do Bible studies. And I got to know the pastor, and I had told her, Mom is in hospice. I called her Mom. She was my mother-in-law. The pastor came over, and two things helped. She gave us the name of a funeral home. That's important. And she shared her own story of grief when her father died a few months ago. What is grief? Grief is when you're really, really sad, something has ended, or there's been a death, and you grieve, your heart hurts. So we call it the grief process. And she shared about her grieving and her mother's grieving. She then prayed over Mom. Mom was still asleep, and spoke sweetly to her in her ear. And then she left. We stayed till the end of the afternoon, and then we left, thinking we'll be back the next day. And in the, not too late, about 9:30, the hospice center called Steve, my brother-in-law, and said that she had passed. Now that's a word we say. It's a softer word than to say she had died. People will say, oh, I'm so sorry your mother passed. When did she pass? I mean, you can say die. When did she die? But it's just a little more gentle. I'm sure you all, in your own language, have that distinction, that difference, a kind of a reality word and then a softer way of expressing that. The first question the hospice nurse asked was, what funeral home have you selected? And that gal, that pastor, had given us the name of a funeral home. So Steve was able to tell her, because the people from the funeral home came and collected her body that night. We call them the undertakers. They undertake to take care of the body, they came. But before they took her away, Steve and his brother, Mike, my husband, were able to go and be with her, their dead mom, and pray over her and touch her. Mike said her body was still warm. So they had some private time, the two brothers, with their mother. The next day was Saturday, and we were going to leave Sunday. We thought we were just going to say goodbye to Mom because the hospice nurses, said the average time of people in that hospice place before they died was 2 weeks. So we were going to say goodbye. We were not going to stay until she died. But by grace, she did die. So they got to be with her, both Mike and Steve, and we got to help Steve make the decisions at the funeral home. The next day, there was a meeting with the director of the funeral home and what Mom had wanted done with her body and what the arrangements were going to be. The three of us made them. So Mom had wanted to be cremated. That means she had wanted her body not to be buried in the ground as a whole body, but to be burned and just her ashes collected. I would say that's gaining popularity here in our country. It's less expensive. The ashes take up less space. So more and more people are doing that. So she wanted to be cremated. At the funeral home, there was a price list of every service we could have imagined. And if we had had a graveside funeral or a church funeral there, they would have provided like the car, just everything imaginable. This can get very expensive. But we kept it simple. There's going to be a service soon in the place where Mom used to live, that retirement center by that pastor. I'm going up soon to help clear away all her things with my sister-in-law, her furniture and her possessions, and pick out what we want. And then Mike and his brother are going to fly back to Seattle, where Mom had lived with her husband, my father-in-law, for more than 50 years. They're going to fly back with the ashes on an airplane, and there will be a small service there for her friends that live there. Our whole family is not participating because we were all together in November for Thanksgiving. Steve and his wife brought Mom to our house in Alabama. Our two sons and their children traveled in, and we had 3 days together. Mom was able to eat, talk, use her walker. She got to meet 4 of her great-grandchildren. That means my sons and their wives' children. My sons are her grandsons. Their children are her great-grandchildren. So what is going on now? Mike and Steve, the two brothers, are dealing with lawyers because of her will. A will is what people write, and then a lawyer stamps it, certifies it, makes it official because the person signs in their presence when they're of clear mind about what they want done with all their possessions. That's called a will. So there's a lot going on with that. Her bank accounts, lots and lots of paperwork here when somebody dies. That's probably the same for you. One other thing I want to mention is there are lots of new trends here in America. So you can have a body buried in a cemetery. The ashes can be placed in a jar called an urn and placed in a church or in a niche, a small open compartment, like in a wall of remembrance. Ashes can be buried underneath a tree. They have memorial gardens. Ashes can be thrown into the sea, or you could keep the ashes in the urn, in the jar in your house. There are now funerals at homes. There's such a thing as eco or green cremation that doesn't burn the body. There's now something called a death doula. That's a person who helps the dying person and the family make all these decisions, a death doula. So, is there any lesson I learned from this? Yes. 1, have a will. Have all your bank accounts in order. But the most important thing for me is don't have too much stuff. Don't accumulate too much, because your kids are just going to have to take care of it. And so much of what we think is wonderful, they don't want. We don't want any of the furniture that Mom had. Steve and Eve don't want any of the furniture that she had. Just a few remembrances. So, what's happened in your life? How many people that you love have died, and what was that like? How do you and your country handle death, and what happens after death? It's an interesting but sobering, sad topic, but it's important. It's okay to talk about it. It's part of life. Well, that's it for this episode. I'm Maria from English Without Fear. Talk to you next time.